I'm excited to welcome everybody today to the conversation about a new project that CCHI is undertaking that we call EtoE Study. And my name is Natalya Mytareva. I have been with CCHI in different capacities, from a commissioner to chair, and now I'm executive director. And I'm a Russian interpreter and translator, trainer by education. So this is the project that's very dear to my heart, and I am excited to tell you about the project and why and how we see it happening. I want to start, since I know a couple of you are new to this topic, to start with saying why we thought about it. As you know, CCHI is a national certification entity, and when the commissioners got together almost 10 years ago, in 2009, we really wanted to create a national certification that is building on the experience and lessons of previous certifications. At that time, in 2009, we had certifications of court interpreters. We had American Translators Association certification exam. We had RID exam. So we gathered a group of advisors, and the commissioners, founding commissioners, also represented different stakeholder groups. And we tried to create an exam and the whole process of certification from scratch, with the understanding that we wanted to reflect the best practices for the testing of interpreters. And one of the major issues was, how will we make the certification process inclusive and also equitable to every interpreter of any language? Because it's important that we don't tell some interpreters, yes, you can take the test now, the rest of you have to wait. And if we go down that route, which we've seen obviously court interpreting profession, translating translators go to, there will be no time for every language to be added as tests, right? And we know new tests are added. And even if we look at the language proficiency testing industry, which tests your ability to speak, understand a language, still, yeah, they have over 100 languages, but it's not all languages that are taught or talked and need services in the United States. And so throughout this 10-year existence, we were thinking of how can we engage every interpreter and have a program that speaks to everybody. And so that's why I can truly say that the English to English project, or EtoE, that we are talking about today really started with the beginning of CCHI, and reflects the ideas of inclusiveness and fairness in terms of all testing of interpreters of all languages. As you know, we have two certifications that both nationally accredited. With the first one is CoreCHI, which is a knowledge certification about interpreting in healthcare, and it's available for interpreters of any language. And it consists of a written exam in English, 100 questions that tests your knowledge about healthcare interpreting. And then we have another tier of certification that we call CHI, Certified Healthcare Interpreter. And that one is actually your skill-based, your performance certification. And currently we have it in Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. So if we look at it from the perspective of today, we really have everything covered, right? We have 3 major languages having the performance exam, and then the rest take the written exam and get certification at that level. So why would we want to change that? Well, first of all, we recognized from the very beginning, and we've had these conversations for several years now, that written certification for the rest of languages is simply not enough, because ultimately it does not tell us whether the person who knows about medical interpreting, who knows medical terminology, who may have critical thinking abilities to actually apply that knowledge to their job, can they actually interpret between two languages accurately? That's the question that is not answered by our written CoreCHI exam. We know that, but that was a starting point. So now we can start thinking that, all right, we are mature enough to think of the next step. We also know that language proficiency testing is not enough, because it tests your ability to speak the language, to understand the language, but it doesn't tell me, again, whether you can actually transfer the meaning accurately between two languages. I see many of the familiar names on today's audience, and I know you know, like me, who also has the managing experience, recruiting experience, training experience, that there will be two people who speak, let's say, French or Kiswahili, and they have the same educational level, they have same level of, at least they say they have the same level of speaking the non-English language. Their English is the same, and yet one of these people will be a great interpreter and the other won't. And how we can test that is only through interpreting tests, really not through the language proficiency test, because the language proficiency in both languages will be the same. And ultimately, the reason we want to change is the whole purpose for our existence of CCHI and existence of our profession. We exist to serve speakers of different languages to understand each other in healthcare, and the primary consumer of our services is patients, because patients are in the vulnerable position compared to providers, healthcare providers, who also deserve and get our services, but patients don't have that power of knowledge of the healthcare system. And every patient deserves the same level of service, regardless of what language they speak. And when we provide certified interpreters to Spanish-speaking patients, we fulfill that require that, requirement and that right. But if you are a patient of Burmese, of Kiswahili, of other languages in the United States, because there is no skill-based certification, what those patients get, they get bilingual individuals with good hearts who want to do their best, but who have never been tested on their ability to actually interpret. And so by trying to push the certification process farther and further, we are ultimately trying to do our responsibility to the patients who deserve the same level of service from interpreters, and not get preferential treatment if they speak one language. I mean, inadvertent preferential treatment, but it still would happen. So when we look at our business model, we also wanted to make sure that whatever we create exists, and the credentials that we create are valid and available to interpreting profession for a long time. And so we looked at the numbers of the growth of certified interpreters, and the first line you see that is rising very steeply, very fast, is certified Spanish interpreters. You can see we almost are around 3,000 over the since 2011, when the exams started being administered. That gold line, these are our CoreCHI certificates, and still, as of today, we have around 900. I think yesterday I checked, it was 906 to be precise. But you can imagine that if we start looking at breakdown of the languages of these 900 certificates, we will see that we really don't have enough certified interpreters in the country to serve patients at the level they deserve. And then here are these numbers for the certified interpreters in Mandarin, that's the red number, 155, and Arabic, which is 95. And so looking at this picture of the certification from a business perspective, obviously tells us that if we create the next language, be it Russian, Portuguese, doesn't matter what language is, we could only see these numbers. And creating a skill-based or performance certification exam is an expensive enterprise, expensive in terms of human resources, because we need to involve at least 50 volunteers to write the exam, to validate it, to rate it. Then we need to have at least 200 people to pilot it so that it has validity, statistical validity. So if we have this 250 people to create the exam, then in order to pay off our investment, even of the time, forget the money at this point, we'll need another at least 250 people. And if for 8 years of existence we only got 155 certified Mandarin and 95 certified Arabic, then it means that creating new exams is not possible and self-sustainable if we look at it strictly from the numbers and business perspective. So the commissioners assessed all that and decided, well, we need to have a different approach. We cannot wait for the next decade, 100 years to have 10, 15 exams available, but what about the rest of the languages that will never get the exams, performance exams in their language? So we looked closely at the group of this 900, and here is what you can see. Again, this data is as of mid-December. So for last 8 years, we have 121 Russian certified interpreters, certified CoreCHI, but the language is Russian, and then you get 81 Vietnamese, Koreans, and you see that down the road. We have a very pleasant surprise here that we have 55 Nepali certified interpreters, which truly shows that certification is really not about the numbers of interpreters in the United States, because I bet you there are more interpreters who speak French or Polish or Swahili than there are Nepali interpreters. But the numbers of certified interpreters reflect the desire and organization of that language group too, to pursue their professional development and careers. We're very pleased to see that sign language interpreters are more and more choosing to add our certification to their performance-based certifications through RID. But again, the numbers that we're seeing are very low, and if we will create, we're not ready to create even a Russian exam for another 2 or 3 years, right? Not to speak of the other ones. If we want to create that exam the right way, with the statistically valid sample of pilot takers, with the statistically valid pool of qualified raters. And those are the caveats. Yes, we can create a test tomorrow, but it won't be at the same level of validity as our CHI Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin are. And we don't want to lower the bar for the test. What we want is to come up with a solution that allows interpreters of these languages to show that they have the ability to interpret. They just don't have the opportunity or the tool to take the same level of the testing in the dual language format, but maybe there is something else. So there are obviously challenges of testing interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion or lesser demand. And just briefly, how they both very conveniently make the same abbreviation, LLD, but languages of lesser diffusion and lesser demand vary depending on different factors. For example, in Akron, Ohio, where I'm from, we don't need Japanese interpreters at the same level as, let's say, they are needed in California or Washington, state of Washington. So for us, Japanese is a language of lesser demand. However, it's truly not a language of lesser diffusion, because there are lots of college courses to become a Japanese, to study Japanese. There is a lot of online support and references for Japanese language compared to languages of lesser diffusion such as Karen, Burmese, Kinyarwanda, and indigenous languages also fall into the category of languages of lesser diffusion because their numbers of interpreters are small, the number of resources is meager, and the number of opportunities for training are pretty few. So that what makes that distinction between languages of lesser diffusion and languages of lesser demand. But regardless of which language we're referring to, if you are outside of Spanish, right, you're pretty much in some area of the country, you will be LLD, right? The challenge here when you create the exams for any of these languages is how do you decide whether it's feasible or not? What would be the pool of potential certificates? We as a profession still don't have the statistics that are gathered to tell us how many certified interpreters of that language we really need in healthcare and how many of them we need in court. I imagine we need fewer in court, right? Because not every non-English speaking person would face the court during their lifetime. But we can pretty much guarantee that everybody will face the interaction with healthcare system, right? We all either need a flu shot or break our legs or we need a tooth pulled or we deliver babies. So regardless, or our babies get sick. So regardless of the language, we all have the need to access healthcare, and for that reason, we could reasonably assume that we need more healthcare interpreters in each of the languages of lesser diffusion or lesser demand than court interpreters. So that's a good answer, but how many we still don't know. And because if we plan to certify only, let's say, 100 interpreters of Nepali, and we think that that's enough for the whole country, which I know it's not, but let's say we decide it's 100 for them, that these are the individuals who will be able to earn livelihood by being a medical interpreter, then developing a test that costs about $70,000 to $100,000 for 100 people is something that could be only done through charitable donations. There's no way we can, do it by investing the normal operational funds. So that's one of the parameters that we need to look at. If we look at the educational opportunities in the United States for studying these languages, that will be another level of what I would say belongs to equity and fairness side of this problem. Because if I wake up today and decide I want to study Burmese, and to the point that I will be a medical interpreter, I can't. I really can't. There is no course from beginner through advanced that will take me to knowledge of Burmese within a reasonable time. And by reasonable time, I'm thinking 4 years. So yeah, I'll have to travel to Burma, and there I can learn Burmese. But what about Karen? Right? Karen is a language spoken in Myanmar that is not taught at the universities or schools in Myanmar because it's one of those minority languages that has been oppressed for a long time. There are no textbooks about medicine in Karen, so I will never be able to become a Karen interpreter if I am a person born in the United States, or if I come as a Karen child to the United States and then go through the U.S. School system, I will not have the opportunity to study my native tongue and maintain it to the level that I'll become an interpreter. So that already makes it harder for interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion to gain the same education as for interpreters of Spanish, Russian, German, Japanese. So, and that means that the testing that we apply to them needs to take into account if your pool of potential test takers doesn't have access to the same educational resources as Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin interpreters do, then it's just unfair burden on them to go through certification. And I already touched upon the lack of the resources in languages of lesser diffusion. Think of the indigenous languages. How many written dictionaries do you have? How many oral audio libraries do you have that give you the opportunity to self-study and look up terms of how to interpret, let's say, for Quichua or Cantabal into English? Right? So that disparity exists for languages of lesser diffusion as always. And I'm especially aware of it when I do trainings and I have a mixed group of students and I tell them, well, your homework is to go and look up these terms in the dictionary. Yeah, Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin come back with all these lists and all this work done. But Karen, Burmese, Nepali, Zapoteco, they cannot look it up anywhere. So I've known some, interpreters of refugee languages whose sole purpose of knowing how to, reference is a translated Bible. So how are you testing? How do you provide fair and meaningful interpreting tests to interpreters of those languages? That is a big challenge. And online presence of some LLD communities. Think of it. We're so used to Googling things. Like as a Russian interpreter and translator, the new term comes up. I start, Googling and, I check in every other month and I see how the term evolves and I can discuss it on Facebook with my friends. Well, not Facebook maybe these days, but anyway, but there is an opportunity for some languages there that does not exist for interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion. Because they're not online. And so they don't have even that resource. So it is truly, truly important. And when you think of the certification process to be fair and equitable, to think of these things. Limitations of proficiency testing. We know there are over 100 language tests by ACTFL, by ALTA, by, language stats. I mean, there are many companies that have language proficiency testing. We all, in smaller agencies where I worked in refugee resettlement agency, we create our own language proficiency test to screen candidates of who we employ as interpreters. But, and we can test if they can speak Kinyarwanda or at least 100 languages, but that test won't tell us if they can interpret. Who are the raters for these language proficiency tests? Because, let's take the largest one, ACTFL tests. Of course, they created the exams based on good psychometric practices. I never doubt that. And they have the best, intentions. But if, let's say, they do have, I don't even know if they do, like Kinyarwanda as language proficiency test, how many raters do they have for it? I'm sure for Spanish, they have hundreds and thousands of raters. But Kinyarwanda, I bet you they'll have probably 5 maximum across the United States, or maybe 3, right? Nobody knows. It's a private, entity. And with the smaller pool of raters, the more they have a tendency either to act as gatekeepers. And, we all, especially if you're a trainer, you've all heard this conversations coming back to you. Well, I failed my language proficiency exam, but it's because they don't want me really to pass, because there'll be then more competition and they won't get the pay rate high. We have these conversations in the profession. They are under the surface, but they exist. And that comes because of the process being closed, because it's commercial and proprietary, but also because inherently you will not find 100 Kinyarwanda raters and be able to train them. And so the raters of languages of lesser diffusion first deal with the fact that there are very few of them. Second, that we don't know how often they rate. They may be rating 2 exams a year, right? Then how objective would the scoring be? If in some languages, even the most robust language proficiency tests will only have 1 rater per candidate. CCHI exams, we have 2 raters rating each audio recording. So there are 7 of them. So up to 14 raters can rate 1 exam. And if they disagree on each recording by 1 point, then a 3rd rater comes in. So the system is meant to be fair and actually as objective as it's possible when you deal with human rating. But if you only have 1 rater, or if there are only 3 raters, you can run statistical reports on 3 raters. Yes, you can. But how meaningful are they if you're only comparing 3 people who may have different other external factors affecting their performance. So my point is the language proficiency testing, no matter how good it's built for, let's say, Spanish, when you start applying the same model to languages like Kinyarwanda, Karen, Chamorro, Kiche, the quality will go down because there simply won't be enough the volume and the rate pool will not be enough to make it statistically even similar to that of Spanish. So the test may be good, but the process is not going to validate the results. We also know that there are different recommendations about what language proficiency level should an interpreter have, and we all pretty much agree on it. However, there have been no studies to saying if that's really true. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying just give me data. Give me data to show that this is true, that you need to be at medium advanced level to be able to interpret, so near-native speaker or whatever it is that you want to say that this is the minimum you are willing to accept. And the other thing is, as managers of interpreting services, we all know that, yeah, we'll demand that from Spanish candidates, right? But when we see the person who speaks Mon, M-O-N, another language from Myanmar, or Hakachin, you'll be happy to take anybody who can read and write, right? So that's the thing, that we as a profession lull ourselves into thinking that we have all these things, we have these tools, when we really don't have the data to prove their validity. And that's why we are really thought that it's time for us as a community, as a profession, to recognize this lack of data and move away from that. Because what if, we know what the sliced bread is, right? That's the dual language proficiency interpreting exam. There's nothing better than that. We know that. But what if we can come up with some other thing? What if we could create some monolingual interpreter skills test that would help us more than written tests that we have right now as CoreCHI, and more than language proficiency test, or more than these two together? Because what we really want to know, if this person who speaks Bulgarian, can that person interpret or not? And with that is how our idea for the EtoE project was born, and how we started pursuing it. And of course, we cannot, rely on anecdata any longer. We all, and I actually see the faces on this call and this webinar today, that we've been in the brainstorming sessions. We've know the thing, our gut feeling tells us that's how it should work. But we work in healthcare. Evidence-based medicine is the reality, and that's what's valued. If we as interpreters are viewing ourselves as equal partners in the providing care to the patient and their families, we need to hold ourselves to the same standards. And for that reason, if medical profession needs to provide data for everything they do, so should we. And it's time for us to move to real data instead of anecdata. And we started with a long route. It's a long process. It's not going to happen overnight. So in 2017, we had several focus groups to take the environmental scan to know how the group is feeling, because that's what the commissioners felt. But we cannot create it by ourselves. We need to know if it's really needed by the field. And we're very pleased to know that, in fact, the majority of the focus group attendees, the 40 experts from across the United States, we had different stakeholders, from interpreter trainers to representatives of language companies to consultants. I'll give you a couple of language companies we had represented with Certified Languages International. We had TransPerfect, Marty. We had, as far as the experts, just to give you a couple of names, we had Cindy Roth, Nora Good, Colin Goodfriend. So we had the names that you recognize. We had people who come from different perspectives. We had sign language interpreters and those focus groups all helping us. Like, what if we tried to create that general English to English interpreter skills exam? Would it be something that we, and do it in a way that proves statistically the concept will it work, and we had their support. And then in June of this year, we gathered a smaller group, National Task Force for the EtoE project, which consisted of 22 experts who are trainers who had trained in different capacities, online or in person, and have them prepare a written recommendations for developing this exam. Again, they're just another layer of the process to get the richness of experience we all collectively have as a profession before we actually jump into creating the exam. We're publishing every step of the way. We're going to publish the reports, and the first report we published this May, that's based on those focus groups. So over this holiday period, since you have nothing else to do, just read it. There's a little bit more of the scientific foundation there, and then the next publication, the report of the National Task Force, will be hopefully published in January. I mean, I don't want to tie ourselves to any specific date because we go through several iterations of it, but we are ready to get to the state of publication it. So what would this English to English study really do? Well, two things. One is we want to answer the question, do interpreters possess this unique interpreting cognitive skills that make us convert the message accurately from one language of another? And that, in other words, we're trying to say that interpreters have these cognitive skills. Simple bilingual speakers don't have them, not because they're not born with them necessarily, but they haven't developed them, right? And part of our professional training is improve these skills to help us do our job. And the second question to answer is, all right, let's say we have these skills. Can we measure these skills in a monolingual format? And because we're in this country where the main language is English, it's easier to create a test in English. But let's say if the concept really is proven, then if you're in Korea, then you can create a Korean monolingual exam for interpreters that tests their cognitive skills ability. So it doesn't matter what language it will be, we're just starting with it English, and that's why we call it English to English. So, but how do we see it happening? Well, the first step would be, the next step will be to get a group of volunteer subject matter experts of different languages who will write the items based on the National Task Force recommendations. And that call for volunteer SMEs is coming out within a couple of days or weeks. In January, at the end of January, we hope to get the first virtual meeting of those volunteers and actually start writing the test. Then we will need to pilot the test. So we will be looking for 300 volunteer interpreters of Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. And we'll ask them to take the English to English test that is written by these SMEs, and then take the regular CHI exam in these corresponding languages. Because we have these already CHI exams, that's a valid tool. We have the stats on them. We have the comparison and of performance between different languages. So if this English to English test would compare against these three tests as valid, either overall or by components, then we will have our data and our foundation for creating the real English interpreter performance exam. What I mean by overall or by components, maybe there will be the correlation that all candidates, or enough candidates, statistically enough candidates who pass English to English test, pass CHI Spanish test. If there's one-to-one correlation with that, that's a winner, right? Maybe we won't have that correlation. Maybe what we'll find is that, okay, all candidates who passed this specific component, let's say paraphrasing, also passed CHI exam, then we'll know the cognitive skills of interpreters really lie in paraphrasing or in whatever element that would be. So the statistical the psychometric analysis that will be performed afterward will provide us this data that is valuable not only for test development, but also for trainers and for interpreters themselves to know what they need to master more or less. However, of course, we cannot see into the future. Maybe the study will be inconclusive, and then the answer will mean like, yeah, there is nothing better than the sliced bread of dual language interpreter testing. That will be also at least evidence and solid driven data approach to a continuing certification process. So, but this is how we'll see this study. As far as the specific component, just to give you examples, what kind of skills we'll be able to measure through that test. Well, active listening and reading, because as you understand, active listening and reading has nothing to do with what language you do it in. You either are able to actively, process the message or not. And so this way we can test it. It's a skill that interpreters need in order to, help them down the road and actually do the interpreting. Down the road, I mean within seconds, but this sub-skill we can test in English. Anticipatory listening and reading, same thing. It doesn't matter in what language you can predict what the speaker wants to say next. It is a skill that exists outside of your specific language. However, here there is a caveat. Obviously, the better your language knowledge is, the better you are at anticipating. And if you don't know enough English grammar, in other words, you won't be able to predict certain things that, you have to do something, right? Instead of you have do something. Those kind of things depend on the language a little bit more if it's grammatically driven. Message analysis. Again, it is a cognitive ability of a person that doesn't tie directly to the language, and we can test it in English and it will be applicable across the languages, because you either can tell that, well, in this speech, the person made 3 points and the conclusion was, you either are able to do that or you're not able to do that. Comprehension of oral and written text, of course, that will be tested in English. Retaining and recalling information, that short-term memory that interpreters need to possess. You're either able to keep 30 words in your mind or you're not. And it doesn't matter in what language it is. However, again, there is a caveat. The better you know that language, the easier it is for you to remember the words. But memory capacity is still is able to being assessed without necessarily tying it to a specific language. Mental agility overall, that whole ability to put all your thinking in focus, of digging deep into your knowledge of language, of coming up with versions of variants in your head, all that is something that is happening in the head of the interpreter, is skill or ability that we could measure through different types of items. Accurate reformulation of the source in the same language, in other words, fidelity to the message. What we notice, and especially I did recently doing the analysis of our failing candidates on the oral exam, is that candidates who fail the exam seem not to grasp the understanding of when the meaning is the same and when it's different. And so if we can capture this, if we can measure this ability to reformulate, to paraphrase the same text in the same language, maybe that would be what makes us all interpreters. We don't know, but hopefully we'll answer that. Understanding the concept of register. Of course, we cannot truly test register unless we do it within two-language or dual language exam, but we can check if the person can, let's say, even like through simple multiple choice picking. All right, here is your keyword, and then you have 3 options. Which of them are closer in register to the original word and which are different? Attention sharing skills, because part of the interpreting performance is to be able to listen to something, think in your head, and say what you already need to interpret at the same time. So that requires you to be focused and yet share your attention effectively. We can test that in any language. We don't need to do it in 2 languages. Self-monitoring, again, very important and critical skill that I think is tremendously overlooked by training that we are giving so far, is that do you really hear what you're saying when you're interpreting? Are you able to catch your own mistakes? Again, when I was doing the analysis of our failing candidates, you know, you could, observe that they simply, if they heard what they said, they would have corrected themselves. And the passing candidates do that. But the candidates who fail the exam seem not to even pay attention to what comes out of their mouths and is recorded on the test. Fluency in English, we can definitely test, both grammatical, lexical, and then speech quality, pronunciation, prosody, pace, speed. At least that would be an indication to the consumer of our product, of employers of interpreters. They will know that after completing this English to English test, also there are some of these last two are the parameters of the language proficiency testing, that they have been assessed and the candidates met the minimum parameters. And I'm not talking about the accent here. We all have accents. I'm talking about the intelligibility of the speech, fluency, the correct emphasis, and the correct speed, which is not too fast and not too slow. Specific types of examples, like how are we going to test the skills or sub skills? Well, paraphrase. I already mentioned this, and for those of you here who are not trainers, the example will be, instead of saying what a great day we are having today in Ohio, it will be it's a gloomy day in Ohio, or it's a duck soup in Ohio, right? That's what it is today, actually. But paraphrase is this intra or monolingual reformulation of the same thought. And that's what we do, because you really, as interpreters, because we don't repeat the same words in the other language, right? We repeat the concepts, the meanings, the constructs, and that includes the paraphrasing as part of that skill. Shadowing. I see many familiar faces on the webinar, so I know that I don't need to explain a lot about shadowing, but there is actually a very interesting, school of thought in among European trainers of conference interpreting. So one school of thought thinks that if the student was successful at shadowing, they have higher chances of being good simultaneous interpreter. And then the other school of thought says, no, that doesn't say anything. If they're good at paraphrasing, they will be good simultaneous interpreting. However, there are no statistically valid studies to prove either of these points. So we hope with the EtoE study we'll be able to answer this question, because we have 300 people do both, and then we'll see if it means anything. If they, let's say, all 300 people excelled at doing paraphrase and they passed the exam, CCHI exam in Spanish, then paraphrase wins, right? If it's the opposite, shadowing wins. What if none? Well, then we'll have to think deeper as trainers and interpreters. Memory capacity, that type of item would be, so shadowing will be the interpreters repeating the same thing in English simultaneously with the speaker, while memory capacity will be an item where first the candidate will listen, let's say, to a sentence with 10 words, and they need to repeat them in English. Then it'll be 25 words, then it'll be 35 words. On the current CCHI exam, in the consecutive part of it, our rule is to have the utterances up to 35 words in length. Have utterances which have 5 words, like, okay, how are you today? But we also have utterances which are no more than 35. So we're not doing the long consecutive in our exams, because that's not what we do in healthcare. And this memory capacity item would be reflecting that reality of the dual language CHI exam. Close, that's another type of activity that as trainers we often and as students of a new language we use. In other words, we have a sentence with a blank word, right, and you fill in that blank. We want to see if we could include something like that, or maybe the oral blank, the audio blank, sorry. Let's say the sentence, the candidate will listen to a sentence without the ending, and they'll need to end the sentence based on what they heard. So again, that's a cognitive ability that interpreters should possess to predict where the speaker is leading and how they would end that sentence. Listening and reading comprehension and English speech production, just normal language proficiency testing elements, but they may end up being very important for interpreters. We don't know. We want to find out. Bilingual bilingual reformulation, what is so-called called back translation or back interpreting. So what we hope to be able to do is this. So the candidate starts the exam by listening to an audio file with, let's say, doctor saying something to the patient. They interpret that into, let's say, Kiswahili, and then they would do all these other things, paraphrasing, shadowing, memory capacity, close this, and then at the end of the exam, the last item, they're listening to the Kiswahili recording, and they're interpreting it back into English. And the raters will be listening and scoring that last recording on keeping the meanings, the units of meaning from the original input. So we know this kind of technique is used by many court interpreting programs as a screening tool for the languages of lesser diffusion. We know the state of Washington uses it in their screening tool for medical interpreter certification. We actually had an interview and in-depth conversation with Dr. Fu, who developed that screening tool for the state of Washington certification exam. So we also know there are people who are, and trainers and interpreters who think that this is not accurate, but there is no data. So hopefully this study will show us if this type of activity actually tells us about interpreting abilities, or it tells us or it doesn't. So this is just there are more elements that the National Task Force are right now busy writing recommendations about, and then the subject matter experts will follow and create the exam about that. So that's the kind of nitty-gritty of what it would look like. Who would benefit from this exam? Well, obviously all of us interpreters, just because we're the profession that has not been studied in depth. All the studies you see, first of all, there are very few, but whatever you see is mostly about conference interpreting, because that fascinates people. Simultaneous, continuous, simultaneous, long-term consecutive, long consecutive, sorry. We have some studies, fewer, but again, reasonably robust for sign language interpreters, and there's pretty much nothing else for and studies of interpreting in settings as healthcare. We bundled up with community interpreters. We described as the short dialogue interpreting. So nobody knows what to do with us. So it would be, it's a principle of putting us on the map as how many conference interpreters are in the world? Much fewer than medical interpreters in the United States, I can tell you that. And for that reason, we are the numbers of our profession, the workforce that we have, deserve to have professional study. Like that. Also, of course, interpreters of languages of limited diffusion and lesser demand, they would benefit, because if the study proves positive, they will be able to have the exam that they could take in English, and they could say, hey, we have passed the written exam about medical interpreting or court interpreting. We have passed this cognitive skills abilities exam, and we have the language proficiency exam or the education level proved in my language. I'm equal to any Spanish certified interpreter now, because it is sometimes hard to, and it's a unnecessary burden on interpreters of those of languages of limited diffusion to have to prove their professionalism harder than for interpreters like Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Russian. So we need to, as a profession, to do good for everybody, not just the top languages. Of course, it would benefit interpreter trainers and educators, because you saw of all these components, the results of the study will be published and available free to everybody, and everybody could then tweak their curricula to, or not tweak, we don't know, but there will be some data for the principles of interpreter training that would improve the quality of training. Obviously, language service companies, our biggest employers in the United States, they will have this opportunity to use the results to possibly create, if they wish, some quick screening tools. Because, when you talk about language companies with high volume interpreting, the turnaround is very high too, right? And you have new candidates coming in saying, hey, I speak, here's my training certificate from this language, from this, I could work for you. And then 2 months later, they discover they cannot interpret. So with this study, if it provides enough data to justify, let's say, saying that paraphrase is the key element of interpreting, then you create your 5-minute screening tool. The person can paraphrase, then you hire them, invest into training them. Or I would love to see if, let's say, memory will turn out to be the most important element. So wouldn't that be sweet if all you need to know if the person can interpret, if they could just repeat 35 words in English, and that would make them a better interpreter? Again, I'm dreaming right now and simplifying things, but my point is that this study, the data will really have practical implications for all levels of all stakeholders of our profession and the profession overall, and of course ultimately patients and providers, because they, as I started saying this in this webinar, they deserve the same level of interpreting services regardless of what language the interpreter speaks. And right now, if we're honest with ourselves, we cannot prove that we're providing that. We may be providing that. We just cannot say that we do because we don't have any justifiable data. So with that, I want to invite you to be part of our study. I want you to participate in different levels. How can you get involved? First of all, if you're an interpreter, we need you to volunteer to become our subject matter and write it. Why we're saying volunteer? Well, not because we're poor. I mean, we are a nonprofit organization, but just to be serious, CCHI's CoreCHI exam, CCHI Spanish exam are accredited through a third party called National Commission for Certifying Agencies, NCCA. And part of the best practices for creating certification exams for other professions, and that's part of the requirement of our accreditation, as the exam items are written by volunteers who are practicing that profession, because they should have no interest in creating items that are harder or easier or different than what they do on the job. So in other words, if we, let's say, pay somebody to write the items and use in our exam, we may lose our accreditation, because that means that we do not reflect the everyday practice of the profession. And since, even though this is a study, it's not accredited, but why would we lower the bar and do it in a different way? We wanted to do the same, we want to apply the same principles to the study as we apply to creating of our exams. And that's why we have to use volunteers. And we hope we hear a lot we have this support. Especially we're looking for languages that have not participated yet. For the certification exam, the requirement is that those volunteers need to be certified. This is a study for the future exam, for which there is no certification on the skill-based level yet. So we are looking for interpreters of Korean, of Nepali, Kinyarwanda, Kichwa, Chamorro, because they will bring their perspective and they will tell us whether the item we are writing would be understood by those candidates equally as by candidates of Japanese, French, Somali. Because think of it, like with that back interpreting, or what we call bilingual reformulation item, the text in English should be of such quality that in pretty much every language there should be words for these words that we have in English. We know many languages, think of Hindi, Nepali, and many others, that borrow English terms. And if in their language there is no other way than to say it in English, then candidates of those languages will have an advantage, because all they need to do is just repeat these English words on the recording, then listen to it and then interpret it back using the same English words. And the readers will never know that they didn't interpret anything. They just used the same borrowing. So we need to create the text that helps us avoid those words. And we can only do it the more people representing different languages we have on the group, the better we can create that type of item. And there are other items, of course, not just that. Then, if you're a Spanish, Arabic, or Mandarin interpreter, or if you have colleagues who are not certified yet, we need you to volunteer and be participants of the study. You know, with the clinical studies, people ask for, participants, then entice them in different ways. We will offer some incentives. I cannot tell you why. I cannot tell you yet what they are, but we will make it your worth to participate in the study as an interpreter, Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin, because we need to have 300 volunteers. So if you're a company who has always thought that, I need to certify my interpreters, but I don't have the time, this would be the good time to do it. You can do it very quickly. And then if you're a hospital, if you're a training company, if you're a language company, we need you as our research partners. And what I mean by that is, this is an expensive enterprise. CCHI has been talking to several entities to help us funding the study. We are putting our own resources into it, but we cannot do it alone. We need to have everybody support it. If you are on our mail list, you already know that we are running a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo platform where we ask you to donate. And no donation is small. $10 is good. $500, of course, is better. But seriously, it is not about how much you donate. It's about your understanding that the money will go directly to benefit the profession at a level that we all can be proud of. I actually have today very good news to announce that we got a partial funding for the project from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant. So we now know that the study will take place in 2019. We know that we'll complete it by 2019, but the grant only funds half of that project. The other half we need to raise money for to make sure we complete it on time. So I really ask you all for your support in spreading the word about it, by contributing, by asking others to contribute, because if we don't do it together, nobody else will do it for us. And I know some of you on this call already have contributed, so thank you very much. We truly appreciate it. And we will do everything to make sure that the results come out as meaningful and transparent as possible. This is not the exam, so it is a public study, so there is no proprietary secret there to hold. We will give back everything that we received from you. To find this place for donation, you can go on our website, and on the homepage you'll see this card, click donate now. But if you want to learn more, you will also be able to click learn more and get to our page with the explanation of the project. With that, I would like to thank you for being here for the webinar and open the floor to the questions.